Should you tip only 20% or is it the bare minimum? Is a question many people in the US are asking, and many others hate the tipping culture altogether. By the way, I got that image from Forbes, and excuse me, what? Anyway, unapologetically, I am one of those many others who hate the tipping culture in the US, even though I don't live there. Why? This is a channel talking about economics, so let us find out why. To those of you who are still unaware that tipping culture isn't so prevalent in other countries, let me tell you this. In most other countries, they have their own culture rooting from hundreds of years, which is why tipping did not make it to their culture list, unfortunately.
Boom. Roasted.
Now, before we begin talking about the US, let's first understand the labor laws of similarly developed nations. I focus my attention on EU, UK, and US when I majored in international labor law, so I'll stick to these countries to compare and contrast. Here's what the UK National Minimum Wage Act 1998 and its Regulation 2015 says. Every employer is required to pay their workers at least the national minimum wage, which is generally set around April of every year. Now, who is entitled to this national minimum wage? Now, pay close attention to this one because this is the most important part. All workers are entitled to the minimum wage, which means employees, agency workers, zero-hour contract workers, apprentices, all workers. This includes workers who are paid in commission or tips, workers who are paid in vouchers or other non-cash benefits, and also self-employed workers who are working under a contract. This means gig workers as well, who are Uber drivers and food delivery personnel. Now, even though the hospitality sector has leeway, tips, however, cannot be used as a way to pay less than the national minimum wage, which means waiters cannot be paid less than the NMW amount, regardless of them working in the hospitality sector and receiving tips. If they do not do so, employers would have to pay a fine of up to £20,000 per worker per day, or face criminal prosecution, which could result in prison sentence of up to 2 years. Else, they could be required to pay back the wages owed to the worker plus interest, requirement to publish an apology, and or pay for advertising to publicize the fact that they have broken the law. Now, here's what the EU law says about the minimum wage. Now, you might be aware that European Union laws do not set a standard minimum wage for all its member nations to follow. Each member nation sets its own minimum wage or relies on collective bargaining to set its wages, for example, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, etc. Here are the current minimum wages seen in the EU countries as of 2022 and 23. The EU, however, does require its member nations to ensure that the minimum wages must be set at a level that ensures a decent standard of living for workers, must be reviewed regularly to take account of inflation and other economic factors, must be enforceable so that workers can actually benefit from it. It might be obvious that not the European Union but the individual member nations decide who does not get the national minimum wage. And yes, in some countries, waiters do not receive the national minimum wage, and these are Denmark, Italy, Austria, Sweden, Finland, Cyprus. Because these nations believe that collective bargaining is a much more fair way to decide the wages. And is tipping a big no-no in every EU nation? Not necessarily. Romania is a good example. The minimum wage of a waiter there covers only 61% of the median wage of an average worker. So waiters there depend on tips. However, the tip is nothing more than 5 to 10% of the bill amount and not a minimum of 20%, because that would be ridiculous. Now, here's why I say that labor laws of the US enable such practices and in fact promote these practices to the point of forcing the general public to pay the salaries of fully employed individuals who are employed by someone else and not them. The United States has the Fair Labor Standards Act that sets minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and youth employment standards to avoid child labor. So the federal minimum wage there is at $7.25 and has been so for over a decade. But every state has its own minimum wage and the wage earner receives whichever is the highest rate among the two. For example, California has $15.5, so Californians would receive $15.5 instead of $7.25, as the former would be the highest amount among the two. Here's where the problem begins. Who are the people that are not entitled to the minimum wage? Number one, employees that are under the age of 20 and are in their first 90 consecutive days of employment. Why is that bad? Tell me, how do you not see a loophole here? According to the US National Federation of Independent Business, the number of businesses that have hired workers under the age of 20
on a short-term contract basis, that is less than 3 months, has increased significantly since 2016.
What does that mean? Suppose you are one of these employers who has hired young workers under the age of 20 for, let's say, $5 an hour for digital marketing. You never have to pay more than $5 ever, because you have hired them on a 3-month contract basis, and the law says young workers under the age of 20 may not be paid a minimum wage for the first 90 consecutive days. So, as soon as 3 months are over, say goodbye and hire the next scapegoat for $5 an hour once again, doing the same job. Or simply mention the sentence, contract may be extended after 3 months, and never actually extended, and say, we do not have the budget to do that. Simple. We all know how such workers do not receive access to health insurance or paid leaves. They cannot count on steady income either, because they do not have a steady job which they believe they had landed. Number 2, people who receive income through commissions are also not entitled to minimum wage, unlike in the UK. So if you are unlucky enough to receive a sales region which was devastated by bushfires or earthquakes, good luck trying to have a roof over your head for that month. No wonder the US labor statistics shows a decline in sales representatives in the country. Number 3, only a few gig workers and zero-hour contract workers are considered as workers employed by an employer, and not all of them receive a minimum wage in the US. You see, gig working and zero-hour contracts are a relatively new concept for them to be well-defined or explicitly stated in the FLSA, and for such workers to be considered as employees and for them to receive a proper minimum wage. As you may have guessed, companies use this to their advantage by either not mentioning the rate before hiring the worker, or if they do, not providing sufficient number of hours for the worker to sustain themselves. Some even go the extra mile by proving how big of a trash can a person be, by injecting a loophole into the contract and use it to their advantage without the worker noticing. Just like how Disney apparently did for over a decade. Actor Joey Bragg claims that Disney had an agreement with the union to pay 88% of the pay, which would be less than the minimum wage, until 3 seasons, after which the crew would be paid the 100% of their pay for the remainder of the seasons. Cunningly but brilliantly, Disney stopped the show by season 3 and continued the remainder of the seasons as a reboot, making the show a whole new different one from the previous 3 seasons. This is why The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody was suddenly The Sweet Life on Deck.
Now, are you familiar with the gear shift?
You mean the Prindle?
The what?
The Prindle.
Are you referring to the shift lever that says PRNDL?
That's a child's Mosby.
And Hannah Montana was Hannah Montana forever after season 3. This way the show could be considered a whole new different one, and the crew could be paid less than the minimum wage. Unfair, isn't it? Now let's talk about tips. Tipped workers are entitled to only $2.13 an hour. Why? Because FLSA says that such workers receive tips for their good work, which I believed was a gesture of thank you received from customers. Well, apparently not. But at least no longer according to the customs and traditions and practices that the labor laws there make us all follow. The FLSA left a major loophole in the law by enabling employees of tipped workers to exploit them by paying them $2 and whatever negligible cents an hour and depend completely on tips for food, shelter and clothing despite having a full-time job, because the law allows employers to do so for as long as paid to the federal minimum wage of $7 and whatever negligible cents an hour, in case the worker does not receive tips up to the minimum wage standards. Obviously, this must not be news to your ears that most tipped workers do not get tipped enough to earn a minimum wage by the end of the day. Because as surprising and as shocking as this might sound, but it is not the responsibility of a customer to pay the salaries of some random food seller's employees. You hired them, so you pay. People around the world are already being breadcrumbed with their salaries that do not catch up with the inflation rate. They cannot sustain themselves. How do you expect them to sustain someone else's livelihood when it is not their responsibility? How thick of a skull is yours for you to realize that this is hurting the economy, not choo-chooing it towards the greatness of wealth? When you ask the general public to pay an extra minimum of 20% in tips, you're asking them to save and invest less and live paycheck to paycheck. With the number of hours you're making them work and the incredible targets you're asking them to meet, buying groceries, planning the meals and cooking takes up a major chunk of their time. It is difficult, especially when you have dependents at home. And if they have multiple jobs, because your greedy rectums will not pay them living wages and instead take home millions of dollars in bonuses. They have no other choice but to eat out, and if they choose to give up on proper food and resort to food sold on junk food stalls or fast food chain outlets, which basically sell bad ultra processed food, you are raising an army of people with chronic illnesses, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, which, by the way, if you haven't noticed, are on the rise. An army of people who are incapable of efficiently doing menial tasks, which were so easy for people to do back in the olden days. Watch the podcast by Dr. Robert Lustig in the description box down below to understand how devastating this is on people's lives. If you continue this, you will end up with higher investments and lower outcomes and practically become a 1980s communist country when it comes to input and output ratio. Your national productivity will take a hit because employers aren't paying a decent salary. People, therefore, are unable to give a 20% tip. Tipped workers are unable to have a living wage, and neither of the two can afford homes. Landlords, therefore, decide to sell all of their houses because they're unable to find tenants. Corporations end up buying all of these houses, if not the most, looking at the falling prices, and there's hardly any flow of money among the masses, and down falls your GDP. You will end up with a major percentage of people dependent on welfare incomes. What are you going to do then? End welfare systems altogether to force people to go work on slave wages to be able to afford either food or housing, but not both? Are you deliberately trying to call a revolution upon yourself? Who are you trying to be? France? Russia? Egypt? I have a solution, maybe. Hear me out before you roll your eyes. I'm saying this is just one of the many solutions that you can come up with, and this seemed like a feasible one, at least to me. Turn towards technology. The world is moving in that direction anyway. Include tipped workers in the federal minimum wage earners list. This might make you believe that many restaurants will then shut down in masses because they will either not be able to afford the increased pay or end up increasing the menu prices and therefore lose all their customers. But no. Let me demonstrate how this can easily be avoided. Urge the restaurant industry bodies to invest in a collective resource planning system. One system that should and must be used by all restaurants and cafes in the country to run the daily operations, from bookings to payments to human resource management, just like how the bus ticketing system in the UK works. One system acceptable by all. And decisions about the system can be made just like how the Federal Reserve runs banks, headed by the heads of various national banks of the country to properly determine the operative procedures and systems to be followed by all banks in the country. Similarly, the various heads of restaurants can invest in a resource planning system and set the operative procedures like they anyway do for industrial uniformity. Using this resource planning system, customers must be able to reserve their seats at their desired restaurants if they wish to, and scan the QR codes at the tables to be assigned a waiter to cater to them. The waiter will use the system to input data and receive payments. At the end of the meal, when the waiter leaves the input device on the table, the customer must provide feedback in order to proceed to make the payment. The feedback received could be a star rating system like in Uber, with a comment section provided in case of a verbal rant by Karens, or if people really want to appreciate the service. This will provide a clear understanding of how good the waiter was at this table, based on which the waiter shall be paid his or her incentive by the employer, who will have already charged the customers only 7 to 10% higher price on the menu items. This will be welcomed, since tips to the waiter will now be legally discouraged unless it is less than 5% of the total bill. Just like how doctors are discouraged from receiving gifts that cost more than a certain amount. Now seriously, do you get yourself a surgery and then pay a 20% tip on top of your bill to the surgeon because he or she operated on you? No. Why? Because surgeons get a very good salary. They do not need any more tips. Exactly my point. Tipped workers would not need any more tips if you paid them a living wage. How difficult is it to comprehend? Oh, human beings. You see how this becomes a win-win solution? Tipped workers receive a living wage, and so employers can decide based on the feedback received from customers whether or not these employees receive their incentives or bonuses. Just like any other non-sales employee in a corporate world receives his or her incentive or bonus based on feedback. The employers get to increase the menu prices in order to pay for the living wages, and customers would be willing to pay the extra amount given that it is only 7 to 10% higher than the previous rates and significantly lower than their current bill plus tip amount. One might assume that this would make people furious. Many prices have been increased, although happy that they no longer have to tip the workers. But a realization that having the best of both worlds in the current scenario is not possible will sink in. If not initially, definitely eventually. Just like how paying a minimum of 20% in tips was collectively believed to be an acceptable responsibility of every American resident and not of the employer, without questioning it even once. Similarly, this idea will also sink in sooner than one might think. And anyone who has dipped their toes into economics knows economics is not about fixing the world's problems through means that make people happy. Nope, that's politics. Economics is about fixing the world's problems by benefiting the most number of people along the way. Now make sure to check out the description box down below to find more interesting content. And if you have an insatiable thirst for knowledge, subscribe.